Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile phones are turned to silent or switched off. Thank you. My name is Councillor Gary Thompson, and I'm the chair of this committee meeting. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee is being live streamed on the council website to enable public viewing of the proceedings, including councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the council website as soon as practically possible after the conclusion of the meeting this evening. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers. Seated to my left, to your right, closest to me, Councillor Jim Park, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Nick Stavrou, our Deputy Mayor, Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, adjacent to our Deputy Mayor, and opposite Councillor Sinfield is Councillor Di Gillies, our Mayor, Councillor Jane Addis, Councillor Susan Bigger, and Councillor Victor Franco, closest to me. A number of officers are in attendance this evening. Seated behind Councillor Galt is Mr Philip Storer, our Chief Executive Officer. Adjacent to Mr Storer is Mr Daniel Freer, our Director of Environment. Seated to my right, Mr Scott Walker, Director of Urban Living. Seated to his immediate right, Christian Wilmson, Coordinator of Statutory Planning. Seated to my left, our Manager of Governments and Legal, Mr Brian Wee, and to his immediate left, Ms Elizabeth Manu, Senior Governance Officer. There'll be a number of other officers presenting this evening, and they'll be introduced as they present their reports. Essentially, the purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the report, which includes a summary of all objections received. For those of you in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be firstly introduced by an officer. I will then call you up one by one to come forward to the end of the horseshoe table to present to the committee. If you're making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you either support or oppose the planning application. Please don't repeat what earlier speakers have said, and keep your submissions focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you're opposed to the planning application, please inform the committee why you're opposed and suggest an alternative approach that would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of histories or details in the officer's report. There is a strict limit of 3 minutes for every speaker this evening. There are a number of speakers presenting, so I will be sticking to our 3-minute mark. And I'll ask everyone to come to the end of the horseshoe table. I'll invite those speaking against to speak first, and then those in support of the application to follow. At the 2.5-minute mark, I'll ring the bell, which indicates that you've got 30 seconds to conclude your presentation. Apologies. Mr Wee, are there any apologies this evening?
Through you, Chair, Councillor Hollingsworth, there's an apology this evening.
Thank you, Mr Wee. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting held on the 3rd of October 2022. Councillors, I'm in search of a motion to move and adopt the minutes. Councillor Galt.
As proposed.
Thank you. And seconded, Councillor Bigger.
Yes, thank you.
Is there any opposition on that? There being no opposition, I'll declare that that motion carried. Thank you, councillors. Item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any conflicts to declare this evening? There appears to be none. Thank you, councillors. So we'll move on to our first report this evening, item 3.1, Rosebery Street Heritage Assessment. This will be introduced by Emile Dixon, Strategic Planner. Thanks, sir. Mr Dixon.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. Good evening, councillors, officers and attendees. The purpose of this presentation to the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to provide a summary of the consideration and assessment of the heritage value of Rosebery Street, Hawthorne East, as prepared by Council's heritage consultant, and to seek a resolution to commence a preliminary consultation process. In 2021, the Brickfields Environs Precinct, which is adjacent to Rosebery Street, was included in the heritage overlay under H0841. As part of the process for including the Brickfields Environs Precinct, Rosebery Street was assessed, and properties on the street were not considered to meet the threshold for inclusion in the heritage overlay. After the inclusion of the Brickfield Environs Precinct in the heritage overlay in 2021, in response to community requests, council officers engaged two separate heritage consultants, Exton Heritage and Context Heritage, to undertake further reviews of Rosebery Street. Both consultants concluded that Rosebery Street did not meet the threshold for inclusion in the heritage overlay, either by itself or as part of a potential extension to the adjacent Brickfields Environs Precinct. In early 2022, further information was received from the community relating to the history of Rosebery Street. This information led to one heritage consultant, Landmark Heritage, concluding that there might be a way to include Rosebery Street, or part thereof, as an extension to the existing Brickfields Environs Precinct. This required a review of the existing precinct and altering the strategic justification for the existing adjacent Brickfields Environs Precinct. This reconsideration is based around the revised citation placing an increased importance on the operations of the former brickworks, when the Hawthorne black bricks were manufactured. This period is also around the time that most of the original housing on Rosebery Street was constructed. Based on their review and further assessment, Landmark Heritage has prepared a draft revised Brickfields Environs Precinct citation incorporating the proposed changes. This has been provided as Attachment 1 to the UPDC report. The draft revised citation does not include all properties on Rosebery Street. Two significant sections are omitted due to limited intactness. A total of 60 properties are proposed to be included in the extension, 48 graded contributory and 12 non-contributory. In the interest of transparency and procedural fairness, it is recommended to undertake a preliminary consultation process in accordance with Council's standard process. As the inclusion of Rosebery Street requires changes to the existing Brickfields Environs Precinct citation and statement of significance, any party can challenge the grading of their property or the precinct boundaries, including properties in the existing precinct, through the preliminary consultation and potentially the formal planning scheme amendment exhibition process. It should be noted that preliminary consultation is only the beginning of a formal process, and that the proposal will be tested through the planning scheme amendment and panels process should it be resolved to proceed this way. Officers recommend that the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolve to note the heritage advice received and documentation provided, including the draft revised Brickfields Environs citation, altered to include Rosebery Street properties, and commence preliminary consultation on the draft revised citation with relevant stakeholders, including owners and occupiers in Rosebery Street and the Brickfields Environs Precinct. This concludes our presentation on the matter. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Dixon. Councillors, we have four presenters this evening on this item, all speaking in favour of the officer's recommendation. I'll call forward our first presenter, Mr Richard Arbon, if you can come forward to the horseshoe table. And so that you're prepared, our second speaker, Mr Darren Simcox, to follow. Good evening, Mr Arbon. Thank you.
Good evening.
If we can just commence with your name and your suburb and your presentation. Thank you.
My name is Richard Arbon. I live in Camberwell. I'm actually reading this on behalf of Christina Brannigan, who I'm sure is familiar to a lot of you, because she's in the UK at the moment with her parents, so she can't be here. So this is actually her speech. So if you could put up the slide, yes, you've done that, thank you. She starts, I support the recommendation. Thank you, Council, officers and Landmark for your work. It was fantastic to read the report and the new statement of significance. The full story of Rosebery Street can now be understood and how it was integral to the success and the history of the brickworks. The report shows that the Brickfields Heritage Precinct does not make complete sense without the inclusion of this street and the more than 50 workers' cottages. The image you can see here is of the brickworks in the mid-1880s, and it shows Rosebery Street in the foreground and one of the first houses which we believe still stands today. Community and council have proven that this street was a brickwork street, with at least a third of the cottages having brickworks connections. Neighbours worked alongside each other at the brickworks over the decades, and we know now that there was even a pathway used as a quick shortcut from their street into the workplace. We know that the Fritsch and Holzer families shaped the original street and owned and rented out housing there. It's been a long road for local people and council. Councillors asked us to find new evidence, and so we did. Many have been involved, and it's a good time to acknowledge some of them. The Hawthorn Historical Society, in particular Libby Love and Liz Ewers, poured over the public archives. Residents on Rosebery Street, faced with losing a street they love, raised funds and actually commissioned 2 independent heritage reports, and I think that's very significant. Nigel Lewis, a heritage expert of great integrity and a key advocate for heritage conservation since its early days in Victoria, gave us confidence. He pointed council in the direction of a way to include the street via the recognition of the importance of the brick company and 1880s Hawthorn Blacks within the statement of significance. He explained that without the brickworks, there would not have been a 19th century Melbourne as we know it. Professor Charles Sauwine of the Royal Historical Society put us on to Gary Vines, the industrial archaeologist. Gary provided advice pro bono. He agreed that the street and Old Brickworks Park are worthy. He encouraged the community to undertake archive research to prove who the residents of Rosebery Street had been. Many hundreds of hours of research later, we provided council with that information. Meanwhile, Dom on Rosebery Street, helped by other residents, was the mastermind of the Community Information Day in the Fritsch Holzer Park in May just gone. Hazel, a resident, had known the Holzer family and started us down the path of proving that connection. Darren and Peter undertook analysis and photography of the precinct and championed the idea that there were entrances and paths directly into the brickworks. Other residents, Sarah, Jane and Chris, kept the street group informed and trawled through title deeds. Many more, too many to mention, got involved as well. Council library staff provided help. Clifford Hayes, MP, generated publicity on TV, and other local MPs raised the street in Parliament, for which we are grateful. The community provided 3 different submissions, each one providing new heritage evidence, and also created a petition. Throughout, councillors Gillies and Bigger strive to help ensure the street's houses got a fair chance of protection. Those of us involved thank everyone. It's been a story of community and council putting together the pieces of an architectural and social history jigsaw puzzle. It was driven by the visceral connection people in Burundara feel for these streets and for the proud local history they tell. Thank you, councillors, for staying with us on the journey and for providing the resources.
Well done, Mr Arbon. Spot on 3 minutes. Thank you for that. Councillors, are there any questions of Mr Arbon this evening? There being none, thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter to come forward, Mr Darren Simcox. Thank you, Mr Simcox. And to follow Mr Simcox, Mrs Nerida Muirden. Mr Simcox, if we can commence with your name and your suburb.
No
Thank
problem.
you.
Good evening, councillors. Darren Simcox is the name. I'm a proud Rosebery Street owner at 21, living there for 20 years. I've loved the history of the street, the houses, just as much as the charismatic people who appreciate and continue to care for them. Excuse me. It's a living historic street. So I support the report. So before you, we have a report that brings together all the important parts that residents have known for so long. At this point, I'd like to thank you, the councillors, for your hard work, for your open-mindedness and patience. Without this, planning and heritage consultants may not be able to show you the importance of Rosebery and links to the Burundara heritage. I would especially like to thank Natica Schneider and her team at Landmark Heritage, Emil Dixon in planning, for looking at what Hawthorn Historical Society and other experts such as Nigel Lewis, Gary Vines had to share, as well as what the Dedicated group as a community were able to bring to the table. I know we were all very busy, but as councillors, I implore you not just to read the summary of this report, but the full 53 pages. It describes some of the building blocks of Burundara and the importance not of just Rosebery, but Fritz Holzer and the importance of the brick industry. Actually, a really well-written, good read containing fascinating information about the history of the local area. So before you is the opportunity to support the Rosebery Street report, not just the grand houses we all admire, but the story behind them, the workers' cottages. Rosebery Street contains substantial numbers of Greater Victorian Federation interwar houses in various scale and form, all owned originally by residents of more modest incomes and pretensions. Thanks in part to their smaller allotments, many of them have survived largely intact and all very unrepresented on any of the heritage registers. Amazing due to the fact that they are all mainly small basic weatherboard houses, which don't normally stand for over 100 years, testament to the craftsmanship. Unfortunately, I'm one of the many residents who over many years been proudly restoring these highly appreciated and desirable homes. It's been hard and costly work. Luckily, the demographic of the street now has the funds to bring these back into life. It's up to you to make sure they will still be there to find the next passionate restorer. The Planning Environment Act in 1987 places an obligation on councillors to conserve and enhance those buildings, areas and other places which are of scientific, aesthetic, architectural or historical interest, or other specific cultural value. We have before you information to help you achieve that obligation. The brick kilns are gone, but the bricks still remain. They're everywhere. Nobody gives them a second thought. That's until they end up in the demolition bin to become non-sustainable, wasteful landfill. The quarry holes are now schools, playgrounds and parks. In fact, without the brick industry, Burranara would not have the open spaces or the parks formed after the holes were filled with our waste. Please recognise just how important these early industries, along with the buildings they built, were in forming the basis of what we now know as Burranara, and help preserve some of what we have left, so the next generation can have some reminders of our past. Your support to the report is requested to help us pass this history to the next custodians. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Simcox. Councillors, any questions? There being none, thank you for your presentation this evening. Our next presenter is Ms Nerida Murden. Mrs Murden, if you can come forward. And after Mrs Murden, Mr Greg Deakin. Thank you. Yep, thank you, Mrs Murden. If you can commence with your name and your suburb. Thank you.
Actually, I was wondering if Elizabeth could put up the photo.
And I might just ask you just to drag that microphone a little bit closer. Thank you.
Yep.
That's better.
Can you hear me?
That's much better. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. My name is Nerida Murden and I live in Camberwell. This photo up on the screen shows the owners of the brickworks, Mr Holzer and Mr Fritz. Hello everyone. I want to thank councillors and officers for all the hard work. In particular, councillors Bigger, Hollingsworth and Gillies for their support. I'm happy to support the officers' recommendation to start the process of protecting 48 houses to be graded contributory as part of a new precinct extension for the Brickfields Heritage Precinct. It's fantastic news that the heritage consultants found many houses on Rosebery Street met the criteria due to their relationship with the neighbouring former Fritz Holzer brickworks, which are now known as the Fritz Holzer Park. I want to acknowledge the enormous amount of research done by the Hawthorn Historical Society and local people who discovered a rich history of the brickworks and Rosebery Street. Uncovering this connection was key information for the heritage consultants. The brickworks were one of the biggest in Melbourne in the 1880s, and famous across Victoria for producing their dark brown bricks called the Hawthorn Blacks. The street was formed in 1884 and the Fritz and Holzer families were involved in the development. They owned land and several houses and rented out houses to brickworkers. It was a working class street and as many as a third of the houses had brickworkers living there. Most of these houses are still standing today. Elizabeth, could I have the second photo, please? Thank you. In May, the community held an information day in the Fritz Holzer Park. Around 200 people attended and shared local history and family stories. This is the flyer that was sent around to all the neighbourhood. We were delighted when a local person supplied this photo up on the screen of their grandfather working at the brickworks. His father-in-law worked in the very hot kilns at the brickworks for 40 years and lived in 2 different houses on the street that he rented from Mr Holzer. The person also told us that their mother was born in Rosebery Street in the 1920s and recalled that cups would shake and the whole house would rattle as the workers were blasting in the quarry. Elizabeth, could I have the third photo, please? Thank you. Up on the screen this is typical of the houses on the street. Most are Victorian, have lots of original features, and as you can see, are a work of art. These remarkable houses are well built, have lovely gardens, and are important to the community. It is great to see Council and the community working together, and I thank Council for the recommendation tonight. That's it.
Thank you, Ms Murden, for your presentation. Councillors, any questions? There being none, you may return to the gallery. Thank you. Our last speaker on this item this evening is Mr Greg Deakin. Is Mr Deakin here? Thank you, Mr Deakin. We'll just swap over speakers. There we go. If we can just commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation.
Yes, Greg Deakin from Camberwell. So following the UPDC committee meeting in October last year, I submitted a paper outlining a conservative approach to incorporating the better preserved western section of Rosebery Street into the Brickfields and Environs heritage area. Without necessarily changing the statement of significance, it seems that these worthy residences have been excluded from the Hawthorn East Heritage Gap project because the whole of Rosebery Street was less intact than other Brickfields areas, including one section of the street was not considered at the time. However, only the southern part of Fletcher Street, south of Bowler Street, was included in HO 841, raising another question regarding the well-preserved row of houses from 12 to 50 Fletcher Street on the west side of the street, north of Bowler Street. It became clear that these were not involved in the Heritage Gap project because Fletcher Street had been compromised by an array of modern developments on the east side. I circulated these observations to councillors prior to the UPDC meeting in February this year. Now, these efforts have been overtaken by the advocacy work of the Rosebery Street Group and the subsequent revised statement of significance presented tonight. We're looking at a better outcome for Rosebery Street than I had envisaged, and significant details have been added to the statement of significance, linking dwellings to the brickworks and significant historical people. The draft citation is more coherent and informative than the current one. But I'm puzzled as to why the historically relevant but unprotected side of Fletcher Street has once again been overlooked. Council officers and councillors were alerted to this anomaly last October and then in February at the time of the 2 UPDC meetings. I urge councillors to support the recommendation to proceed with the expansion of Brickfields and Environs and the revised statement of significance, though I do ask, is it really necessary to consult all the current Brickfields residents on the revised statement? My proposal now is simple. If the council approves the resolution to commence preliminary consultation with stakeholders on the draft revised precincts environment precinct citation, please can you include the residents of 12 to 50 Fletcher Street in the consultation process? There will be negligible additional information cost involved, and it's likely that further information about the broader Brickfields precinct will come to light. As with Rosebery Street residents, this group of Fletcher Street residents were not given the opportunity to comment on the heritage issues. This would complete the circle of Brickfields consultations once and for all.
Thank you, Mr Deakin. Councillors, any questions for Mr Deakin this evening? There being none, thank you for your presentation, Mr Deakin. We will turn to matters arising. Mr Dixon.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I will now provide a response to the matters raised by those addressing the UPDC tonight. Firstly, regarding comments pertaining to Fletcher Street, I can advise that the consideration of Fletcher Street was not part of the scope of this heritage assessment. There has not been a focus on Fletcher Street as being a part of the Brickfields Environs precinct, and no evidence has been put forward to suggest that it should be included. Additionally, no recommendation from Council's Heritage Advisor that it should be a part of the heritage area has been provided. Accordingly, there is no basis to include additional sections of Fletcher Street as part of an expanded Brickfield Environs precinct. It should be noted the southern portion of Fletcher Street already forms part of the existing Brickfields Environs precinct. Residents on Fletcher Street about the Rosebery Street precinct extension will be notified as part of the heritage process, and it should also be noted that all parties who are interested may make a submission during the preliminary consultation process or further in a planning scheme amendment process. Regarding consultation being extended notification of consultation being extended to all those in the Brickfield Environs Precinct. This is necessary in the interest of transparency and fairness, that all those owners and occupiers are notified, which is standard council practice. We note and acknowledge the further comments provided by the other presenters to the UPDC. At this point, there are no further matters to be addressed from the presentations. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr Dixon. Councillors, are there any questions of officers on this item? There appears to be no lights on for officers, so councillors, I'm in search of a motion. That's Councillor Gillies. Sorry, yes, Councillor Gillies. I've just noticed there are two lights on here. Did one of you have a question for an officer? No? Councillor Gillies, your motion.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry if we have created some confusion there. Predominantly the officer's recommendation, but I'd like to propose a slight amendment to the wording, please.
Sure. And we might bring up a Word document if possible.
Yeah, thanks.
We will need to draft, sorry, we don't have a Word version, Councillor, so could we open up a Word document and add Councillor Gillies' suggested changes?
Apologies, Elizabeth, this is at slightly short notice. It's not going to fundamentally change it, but it's just tidying up a little bit of wording here. Okay, what I'm proposing is that the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolve to 1, receive and note the heritage advice, delete the word received and, words received and. Continue then, documentation provided including the draft revised Brickfields Environs Precinct citation which formed part of the Rosebery Street Heritage Assessment. Leaving item 2 the same, no change to item 2. Is that right, sir? Receive and note the heritage advice documentation provided, including the draft revised Brickfields Environs Precinct citation, which formed part of the Rosebery Street Heritage Assessment. Correct.
Okay, so
that's the motion. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'm in search of a seconder. Councillor Bigger.
Yes, please. I'm happy to second that motion.
Thank you. And to assist Councillor Gillies, is there any opposition on that item? There is. Yep. Has been noted. So, Councillor Gillies, I'll ask that you speak to your motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. As we've just heard from our speakers who spoke very eloquently, the previous assessment of Rosebery Street, Hawthorn East the previous assessments did not see Rosebery Street as meeting the threshold required for inclusion in the Brickworks Environs Precinct. However, earlier this year, and largely due to the passionate commitment of residents, historical societies and the community heritage activist group, a new body of material was presented, material that the heritage consultants thoroughly examined, researched and recognised as showing significant strength in the connection of part of Rosebery Street to the Brickworks, one of Melbourne's most important industrial sites. This required a great deal of time and cooperation to be devoted to researching facts that could stand up to scrutiny. I thank tonight's presenters who spoke most eloquently on this. I also sincerely thank the officers for their work, and I thank the community members who have taken a keen interest in this street. Our colleague, Councillor Hollingsworth, who was an apology tonight, specifically asked me to add her thanks and appreciation as well. Whilst this is not the end of the journey for inclusion of Rosebery Street in the heritage overlay, it is a very important step in that direction. And I wholeheartedly commend the motion to my colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Do any other councillors wish to speak to this item? Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. Essentially, my opposition has its genesis in the report at page 10, particularly the last two paragraphs. I think that this is problematic, and given all of the history, it's not a step that I support.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Any other speakers wishing to speak on this item? Councillor Biggar.
Yes, very briefly, because Councillor Gillies has covered most of the things I wanted to say. The one thing that I particularly think is important in Rosebery Street, and I just wanted to note as I was reading the report again this weekend, is that that this is a street of workers' cottages, and it's got the connection to the workers of the brickworks. In fact, I'll just read you a very, very small quote that I thought was really highlighted some of that link to history for us, as it described the occupations of the Rosebery Street residents as being carters, labourers, blacksmiths, together with dye pinkers. Not sure what a dye pinker is. Painters, coach builders, cab drivers, dairymen, maltsters, and strikers, as well as a few people in white-collar occupations. I think it's for us, it's important that we ensure that we protect heritage that links us to both beautiful homes of the wealthy and also the less well-off, the people who built our community, the people who built the bricks that built Melbourne and Boroondara. So I also wholeheartedly support this recommendation, the officer's recommendation, and encourage my councillors to vote in favour of it.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. I've just been reading the basis for Councillor Park's reason to not support the motion. I can understand that it does, if this does pass, it does make open to challenge the existing overlay. Now, look, I think that's something that's real, it's there, it's notified. I think it's good that the report makes that clear and transparent, and I think everybody needs to be aware of that. It's something that I'm prepared to still go forward with. I just want to make that point, and I think everyone needs to be clear about it, and it can potentially, but the heritage overlay, including the existing overlay, needs to stand on its merit. I think it will, but I think it's understandable that it may get challenged. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. There appear to be no further light sounds, so I'll return to our mover to close out debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think a lot has been said. I acknowledge that this is, and the residents are well aware also, this is not the end of the journey. There are risks involved, but they do understand that and are prepared to follow through. I commend the motion to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. I'll put that motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? I declare that motion carried. Thank you, councillors. We'll move on to the second item on our agenda, 3.2, 655 to 657 Glenferrie Road, construction of a 6-storey mixed-use building. And this will be introduced by Ms Kelly Caporoso, Statutory Planner. Thank you.
Through you, Mr Chair, I present UPDC item number 3.2 relating to planning permit application PP22/447 at 655 to 657 Glenferrie Road, Hawthorn. It is proposed to demolish the existing commercial building and construct a 6-storey mixed-use building. The site is located within the Glenferrie Major Activity Centre and within the principal public transport network. It is zoned Commercial 1 and affected by the Heritage Overlay and Design and Development Overlay. The application was advertised and only one objection was received. The following key matters are in respect of this application: the strategic context, car parking, urban design and heritage. The subject site is centrally located within the Glenferrie Major Activity Centre and close to Glenferrie train station and tram stops. The proposed office and retail land uses are strongly encouraged within the Major Activity Centre as they provide employment opportunities and support the local economy. The proposal strengthens the role of the Major Activity Centre as being a commercial centre for people to shop and work and is consistent with Council's strategic direction and local policies. The proposal requires a reduction in the standard car parking rate specified at Clause 5206 in the parking overlay. The proposal will provide 43 car parking spaces, which is a reduced rate by 56 car parking spaces. The proposal is well suited to a car parking rate reduction. It is located next to a train station and a tram stop to encourage the use of public transport, which is consistent with local and state policies. A green travel plan has been prepared as part of the application material, which encourages alternative transport methods. The reduction in car parking is supported by Council's local policies, which seek to ensure development is designed to reduce car dependency. The proposal complies with the maximum street wall height and upper storey setback requirements of the DDO 15. The proposed streetscape presentation materials and design details are complementary to the Heritage Precinct and is supported by both Council's urban designer and heritage advisor. The proposal includes a number of public realm improvements, including a pedestrian canopy to the abutting streets, inclusion of public art along the northern wall, footpath widening to Grace Street, and new public benches and bicycle hoops within the vicinity of the site. The proposal requires a variation to the overall maximum building height specified within the DDO 15 of 4.4 metres or approximately 1.5 storeys. The proposal meets the test for this variation in building height, which is only suitable for proposals demonstrating, amongst other criteria, a very high standard of architectural design. The proposal is entirely supported by Council's urban designer, who notes it offers a high-quality architectural resolution to the site and tangible benefits to the public realm. Its location on a prominent corner with 3 public frontages warrants a stronger and more comparatively higher built form that bookends this section of Glenferrie Road. The upper floor is centrally sided and recessive. Council's urban designer notes it provides a superior outcome, which is described as being well proportioned, considerate and delicately sculpted. The proposal complies with Council's heritage policy. It is set back from the front facade of the adjoining contributory gated building. The proposal does not adversely impact on the view lines to the Immaculate Conception Church as viewed from Glenferrie Road, which is a requirement of both the DDO and the heritage overlay. It is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit subject to the conditions detailed in the Office of Recommendation. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you for the introduction of that report. Councillors, we've got 3 speakers on this item, 1 against and 2 for. I'll call forward our first speaker, Mr Greg Deakin, and followed by Mr Deakin, Mr Rob Fadovic. Thank you, Mr Deakin. If we again can commence with your name and your suburb and your 3-minute presentation.
Yes, Greg Deakin from Camberwell. I was not aware of this application, which has broader implications for the public communal spaces in Burundara. Glenferrie Road is the most attractive of the larger shopping strips in the city. The proposed 6-storey building is described as being well-proportioned, considerate and delicately sculpted, but this doesn't mean it would be good for Glenferrie Road. This representation does not, this is the one up on the screen, does not represent a realistic perspective of the impact of the building on Glenferrie Road shopping strip. I'm sure that with current expertise in visual representation, we could get a better version of the impact of the building than this. It's clear that the building will dominate others in the vicinity, and it's clear that it will impact on the view of the Immaculate Conception Church to the south. I submit that the height and bulk of the building should be reduced in line with the quoted heritage advice in the report. There should be an increase in setbacks to Glenferrie Road associated with levels 2 and 3, and the levels 4 and 5 should be removed. Please don't change the character of Glenferrie Road by adding more and more tall buildings. By way of comparison, consider a recent addition in Gertrude Street, Fitzroy, which preserves the scale of the streetscape. Could we move to slide 2, please? So Gertrude Street has made a spectacular comeback in the last 20 years or so, but there was a time when there were plenty of advocates for high-rise development. I'd just like you to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Deakin. There are no questions, so you may return to the gallery. Thank you. We'll call forward our second speaker, Mr Rob Fadovic. If you can come forward and correct me if I've pronounced your surname. Thank you. And followed by Miss Anna Barclay. Thank you, Mr Fadovic. If we can commence with your name, the company you represent, and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Yep, Rob Fadovic, represent McMullen Group, who are the developer, and we support the council officer's report. We thought it might be of benefit to have a bit of background behind McMullen Group and also the site. I won't take up too much of your time, but the site was purchased in March 2021 for the purposes of an office development. But as well as being the owner and developer of the site, we intend to be the tenant on 2 of the floors. McMullen are a fully Australian-owned, family-run property development business in various sectors in Victoria for over the past 45 years. And for 23 years, we've been in the city of Boroondara through offices in Sherlock Avenue, Cato Street, Burke Road, and currently Railway Parade in Camberwell. We also do a lot of work with Bascare, who are an aged care provider in the area. We've worked with them for the past 17 years, delivering their aged care developments in Faversham and recently Hester in Canterbury and Morgan in Glen Iris. So we've got a pretty good link with the municipality. We're excited by the project and we're excited to continue our home, and our plan is to deliver a high quality development we think will complement the Glenferrie Road shopping precinct. Will redefine the modern office and will be something we'll be proud of. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr Fadovic. Are there any questions, councillors? There being none, you may return to the gallery. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last presenter this evening, Miss Anna Barclay. Good evening, Ms Barclay. If we can just commence with your name and the company you're representing.
Thank you. Good evening, councillors. My name's Anna Barclay. I'm from Urbis. We're the town planning consultants working for McMullen Group. We support the officer recommendation, including all of the conditions. As Rob mentioned, McMullen plan to have their headquarters in this office, and it is a very high quality architecturally designed building, as has been outlined in the officer report. In regard to Mr Deakin's objections raised before, we haven't received an objection from Mr Deakin, and so we're not aware of that until this evening. In regard to the consultation undertaken, we understand 96 owners and occupiers were notified of the application and 1 objection was received. That was from a resident in Kew who objected about car parking. And because they attended the Hulk Recreation Centre. And in regard to that objection, this application won't impact that car parking because that's already very tightly controlled by existing short-term parking restrictions. In regard to the comments made about the height and the setbacks, the proposal fully complies with the Glenferrie Structure Plan setbacks from the Glenferrie streetscape, and that DDO that controls the building setbacks and heights here, it is a discretionary control, but that has a long history following the Glenferrie Road Structure Plan and the controls that are currently in place. That has been through a very extensive consultation process, and the proposal complies with that in terms of the 5 metre setback, as was mentioned, and the upper levels, which are the variation to the height, are set back further, again, to more than 9 metres from Glenferrie Road. We also have the architect here this evening if councillors have any questions regarding the building. Otherwise, I'll leave it there, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms Barclay. Councillors, any questions? There being none, thank you for your presentation, Ms Barclay. I'll return to officers. Any matters arising?
Through you, Mr Chair, in relation to the 3D perspectives, a whole package containing numerous 3D montages from different vantage points were provided through the permit application. They were scrutinised very strongly by Council's urban designer, who noted that the viewpoints to the church wouldn't be impacted, particularly given that there's the overpass for the trains there as well. So that was going to sort of soften the appearance of the development from those vantage points. In relation to the comments about heritage and setbacks, this application has a balance of competing planning policies and issues. It's a strategic site in a major activity centre, and it does vary from some of the requirements in some ways and requires a balanced planning assessment. That's why the officer delegation wasn't exercised in this instance, given there was only one objection and could have been assessed under Council's deed of delegation at an officer level. Thank you, Mr Chair.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? There appears to be no questions. So, councillors, I'm in search of a motion. Councillor Gold, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to put forward the officer's recommendation with a minor alteration in condition 9, which has been prepared prior to this and is now on the screen. Thank you very much.
If you could, just for the assistance of the gallery, could you just read out the changes in item 9?
I can. We removed the words an architect of a calibre equal to the current design planning architect to remove the word oversee, because we were concerned that wasn't strong enough, and the words that have been added in its stead: undertake and manage the design, documentation and architectural overseeing and review role during project construction. So I'll come back to the reasons for that as we go through the presentation.
Thank you. So there's the motion up on the screen. Councillors, I'm in search of a seconder to assist Councillor Galt. Is there a seconder to this motion? Councillor Franco?
Yep.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Galt, is there any opposition on this item? There is a bit of opposition. So I'll move to you as the mover, Councillor Galt.
Thank you, Chair.
Chair, sorry to interrupt. I just wonder if there might be an opportunity if you're willing to put that to the developer's representative just to see whether they'd consent. I note that they were consenting to the other things. That might help inform my position at least as to how I'll vote on this.
Thank you, Councillor Park. I'm happy to do that. Do I have agreement on that from, I can see Ms Barclay is nodding her head, and Mr McMillan, thank you for that. Mr Fadovic, thank you. So Councillor Park, I think we've got some acknowledgement from the gallery. So Councillor Galt, actually I'll just test, is there still opposition on this item? It looks like our opposition has disappeared, Councillor Galt, you lucky thing. So I'll move to you as the mover of that motion to speak to your motion.
I'll speak to it briefly anyway, thank you. Look, in my view, this is exactly the sort of development we need in Glenferrie Road. It's of high quality, and as approved, as shown in the planning documents. It's heritage compatible. In fact, I think the facade that's proposed improves greatly on the facade that currently exists around this site. More importantly, it creates employment in Boroondara, and we're very, very keen to travel less these days and work closer to home, and some of the work being done on the place plan seeks to develop areas around Glenferrie Road that create employment opportunities, and this helps us do this. There are a couple of conditions which we're wavering: less car parks, but there is much promotion these days to reduce the number of car parking, particularly when a development is close to public transport, and this is right next to a station, trams, and hopefully in the not too distant future, a wonderful cycle shared path going from Box Hill through to Hawthorn. It also has plenty of bicycle parking spots on site, which is terrific. It also allows it to go a little bit higher, but this is consistent with the guidelines that we do have, and I note there is no overshadowing and no overviewing created. It's an ideal spot. It is not overlooking residential areas or creating difficulties in other properties around it. And further, there was only one objection. So the reason for modifying condition 9 is that I think that whilst the amendments or the allowances we're making in going forwards on height and car parking are well deserved and proper, they are of value to the developer. And I have been involved with and seen other developments such as this that fall apart when the principal architects disappear or a lower quality architect is engaged further down the track. I'd hate to see this happen to this proposal. So hence the modifications in condition 9. So with that in there, I commend this proposal and the amended recommendation to my fellow councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. I was going to put you happy. Do you want to speak to this item, Councillor Franco? Yep.
Thank you. Look, it's a pleasure to see high-quality architecture and urban design in developments before us, such as this. I've been very outspoken about wanting to see high-quality architecture, and I strongly endorse the comments of Council's urban designer. I think they're spot on. It's a pleasure to see this, and I think the concessions we've made are merited given the circumstances. I also strongly support the reduction in car parking. I think it's something that we'll eventually come to see more and more, and as a council, as we become more urban, we're part of the inner city, we'll see a change from where this past trend of having minimum car parking rates to maximums, and I think it's something of the future that this council needs to look forward to. So look, I'll leave it there. I'm pleased to see a developer coming forward with such high quality architecture. It's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. I feel somewhat obliged to speak against this about the points that concern me here. Car stackers are problematic. And I know that our community, particularly down in this part of Hawthorn, has had numerous instances recently in residential developments where car stackers have been problematic. The height is what concerns me most, and I can't help but to think that driving down the hill southbound on Glenferrie Road, the sightlines of the church spire will be obscured. It will stand out on Glenferrie Road a very long way at this height. I commend what appears to be a high-quality development, and I think the location probably doesn't get much better for a development like this. And it is on those grounds only that I will acknowledge I'm probably the only one leaning towards opposing it in the room, and it will likely pass. But I do think that it's important to call out those couple of things that I really dislike about this proposal. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Are there any other councillors seeking to speak? I'll just acknowledge I'm very much in favour of this development. I think it's a fabulous development on a very prominent corner. I look forward to it being built. I'll return to our mover, Councillor Galt.
I'll simply comment on the two issues raised by Councillor Sinfield. I too was a little concerned about the car stackers, but they're only used in a small number of spaces. They're not throughout the development, and they're supplementary to it. Also, the view down Glenferrie Road towards the church, there is rather excellent renderings provided as part of the planning application, and as the officers have assured us tonight, these are all accurate. And the setbacks to the building and to the upper levels are very generous, and the views are maintained to the church beyond. So I still continue to recommend this recommendation to my fellow councillors. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. I'll now put the motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? I declare that carried unanimously. Thank you, councillors. I'll move on to our last item tonight, item 3.3, 6 Kintore Street, Camberwell, dwelling extension in a heritage overlay. And when ready, this will be introduced by Ms Cassandra Ray, Coordinator of Statutory Planning.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Item 3.3 relates to an application for an extension to a dwelling in a heritage overlay at 6 Kintore Street in Camberwell. The site is located in the Neighbourhood Residential Zone 3 and is also located within Heritage Overlay Schedule 159, which relates to the Prospect Hill Heritage Precinct. A planning permit is required for the partial demolition, construction of external alterations, and construction of an extension and associated works. The decision plans are those attached to Appendix C of the report. However, there are some additional detailing in the plans attached as Appendix D, which are discussion plans, and they're also referred to in proposed condition 1E. The site is graded significant. The planning assessment report notes that the receipt of 27 objections. However, one additional objection has been received. The matters received in all objections are considered in the planning assessment report, commencing at page 159 through to 162. The application has been referred to Council's Heritage Advisor, and written comments dated the 16th of June 2022 are attached within the planning assessment report. Following the receipt of the decision plans, Council's Heritage Advisor has reviewed those plans and are satisfied with the general lowering of the new built form, which is in line with their recommendation. A condition has also been imposed requiring an engineering report to confirm the methodology of the alterations to ensure that the chimney is retained prior to any commencement of the works. This condition provides Council with some extra comfort that the designer, the builder or the engineer thinks carefully of the chimney element to be preserved in situ. In addition, the permit applicant has agreed to a number of additional conditions that seek to preserve and restore the front facade so that the site will make a fuller contribution to the streetscape, and this aids the long-term conservation of the heritage building. Information regarding the site and precinct notes the precinct notes that the significant fabric at the site pertains to the distinctive triple glazed asymmetrical room bay window, typically associated with the architect John Beswick and copyists. The application seeks to make no change to this element other than the restoration works sought through conditions 1B, 1C and 1D. Whilst the application does include some minor demolition to a rear element, this is not considered to undermine the significant host building or the greater heritage precinct. The demolition is not visible from the public realm and are not elements that have significant heritage fabric. The significant rating does not mean that all elements of the building must be retained, and certainly Council's heritage policy does contemplate the demolition to allow for extensions. With regards to the proposed addition, the kitchen provides a link between heritage fabric and the new building. This approach is supported by heritage advisors as it means it provides a transition between the old house and the new fabric. It also means that more of the original fabric remains intact for future generations. Council's heritage policy provides guidance to ensure that new built form does not dominate the original fabric. The policy calls for consideration whether the extension will be visible through sightline analysis. This sightline analysis is provided on page 154 and the proposal complies with it. The heritage policy also requires oblique view diagrams to be submitted showing the extended visibility of the new built form. The oblique view diagram is taken from the eastern tidal boundary, and that has been provided on page 156. This oblique view diagram shows the extent of the original dwelling to be retained, the single-storey transitional space hosting the kitchen, and the main extended dwelling in the background. Furthermore, it should be noted that at the closest point, the proposed extension is located over 30 metres from Kintore Street. In relation to materiality, the proposed materials are recessive but contemporary elements. Materials used in the grey and charcoal tones, picking up the accent colour of the host building. Timber battens relate to the timber elements of the host building. It's for these reasons, the officer recommendation is to support the application. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Ray, for your presentation. Councillors, we've got 10 speakers on this item this evening. Our first speaker will be Ms Liz Burton. But before I call Ms Liz Burton forward, is there a Mrs Sarah Teal-Lee here? No, that's okay, thank you. I actually inadvertently missed a presenter from Rosebery Street. So Ms Burton, if you can come forward, thank you. Thank you very much. If we can just commence with your name, your suburb and your presentation. Thank you. We'll just make sure we've got a speaker on for you. There we go.
Liz Burton, Camberwell. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present to the committee. I wish to raise concerns regarding the assessment by the Heritage Advisor, which is considered to adversely impact the significant grading of the dwelling and has implications for the cohesion of this very important precinct. It is therefore recommended that approval not be granted. The assessment by the Heritage Advisor divides the building fabric into significant and contributory elements of its architectural features. Only the triple gable feature at the front and wraparound veranda are considered significant elements in this house, which is graded as significant. The rest of the building is defined as contributory, and in the view of the Heritage Advisor, any contributory element can be considered for demolition. This seems to be quite contrary to the clauses, the heritage clauses in the Burundara planning scheme. This division into significant and contributory components of a building which is fundamentally intact is a departure from Council's heritage strategy and policy. It is relied upon to justify the demolition of approximately 20% of the original fabric of the dwelling, which is in very good condition and not in need of repair. So I would like to... Shall I just wait while other things are happening? Sorry.
We just have a guest that's come in the councillor's door there. Please continue, Ms. Burton.
Thank you, thank you. I just wanted to stress that approximately 20% of the original building fabric is to be demolished. And I think that's a very important consideration because in significant graded properties, it is not recommended that significant fabric be demolished unless they're in need of conservation. Clause 15.3(1)(l), Significant Heritage Place Strategies in Burundara, refers to supporting the demolition of non-original and non-contributory additions, which is not the case with this dwelling. It is considered that the entire dwelling is significant and cannot be simply a matter of the triple gable and return veranda. Please move forward. Keep going. Thank you. Keep going. Next. Yes. So, no, the previous one. I would just like to point out that the red outline is the original components that will be demolished. Next slide. Thank you. So you can see on the right-hand side, on the next to the triple gable, an original window will be replaced with a modern element. And these are extremely contrary to the planning scheme. The significant area itself is described as a precinct of one of the most intact and homogeneous estates of this type in Melbourne. And the intactness of one of the significant graded properties
I must get you to wrap up, Ms Burton, if possible.
will be severely compromised. So I would like to point out that this has very major implications to the way in which heritage properties are evaluated by council, and it really has properties well beyond considering this individual case, but on
Ms
the
Burton, if we can just
interpretation of the
wrap up
policy.
your presentation.
Thank you.
Councillors, are there any questions of Ms Burton this evening? There appears to be none. Thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter is Mrs Belinda Ramsey, and following Mr Ramsey, Mr David Hume. Thank you, Mrs Ramsey. When you're ready, if we can just commence with your name, your suburb, and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Belinda Ramsey in... Is that working? Yes. My primary... Oh, sorry. I live at 5 Victoria Road, directly adjacent to the rear of 6 Kintore Street. My primary concerns are the proximity of the 2-storey component of the extension extending all the way towards the rear laneway. The height of the wall in the laneway, which is, I think, just under 4 metres. The mandatory garden area requirement of 35% has not been assessed at all in any of the proposal. The scale of the proposed addition is excessive. It will overwhelm the significant structure and surrounding residences by its design and size and choice of fabric. Now, this is where I'm being rude, but I have to say it. Initially, it was to be a large black box. Now it is to be a slightly reduced in height, large dark grey box. It would be the first 2-storey addition extending to the rear boundary in our area, which isn't in keeping with the character of adjacent properties or the heritage precinct more broadly. It should be visibly recessive and read as a secondary element to the heritage place. The Tara estate is highly significant and relatively intact and worthy of the greatest degree of protection, with new development like this extension at 6 Kintore Street are considered for approval. The Council's heritage policy says to preserve significant heritage places. The previous speaker has just really covered that completely. And then use design details which complement the design of the heritage place. And as far as I'm concerned, the very large rectangular structure does not complement the heritage place at all. If approved, the development will set a precedent for future modern structures which will incrementally destroy the heritage value of our area. This is a heritage area. It must be respected and protected. I hope the Planning Committee and the Council members understand my fears for our heritage area. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs Ramsey, for your presentation. There appears to be no lights on from councillors, so you may return to the gallery. Thank you.
Thanks.
Our next presenter is Mr David Hume. If you can come forward, Mr Hume, and followed by Miss Monica Rowland. Thank you, Mr Hume. Yep, thank you. If we can just commence with your name, your suburb and your 3-minute presentation. Thank you.
My name is David Hume. I live in 30 Broadway, Camberwell, 2 streets from Kintore.
Thank you.
I'm 80 years old. I came here when I was 40 years old for one very, very good reason. I lived in North Fitzroy up until then, and I noticed a dramatic change in the streetscape around North Fitzroy. My wife and I decided we live in a better area, so we chose Camberwell. We loved the heritage listing. We loved walking around the lovely buildings and seeing the heritage enacted very well by our forefathers and followed through by the councillors. You've all done a good job. You've kept it. It's amazing that you've kept it, but you have. I also wrote a response when you developed, or the council developed, 57 Cookson Street. You may remember that you stamped the drawings for a very, very significant changes to Cookson Street. It was the first house application to change a heritage listed building by allowing an extension at the back. It's clearly visible from the street, although it was told it would not be. That set a precedent, and that precedent can be now applied to the whole of Cookson Street. Cookson Street is one of the only streets in the whole of Melbourne that has a 100% original character. What you are doing now, you're considering to put in a factory building. We could have moved to Thornbury or Campbellfield, where that's normal, but we didn't. We moved to Camberwell because we wanted the heritage listing. It's a total violation of, I think, what the heritage listing is about. It is a it's a steel frame building with a corrugated zinc aluminum, colour bond coating. It's nothing less than a factory. It's a disgrace. It looks horrible, but it's been allowed under the application to be used, I don't know what for, whether it's a workshop, whether it's a playroom, snooker room, I don't know what it's going to be used for. But I read in the application that there's about 19 pages of reasons why it should be built. I think you only need one page to say why it should not be built. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Hume. Councillors, any questions of Mr Hume? There being none, you may return to the gallery. Thank you for your presentation. Our next presenter, Ms Monica Rowland, if you can come forward. Thank you, Ms Rowland. And after Ms Rowland, Mr Greg Deakin. Thank you, Ms Rowland. If we can commence with your name, your suburb and your 3-minute presentation.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm Monica Rowland from Camberwell, and I live on the other side of the lane behind, at the back of Kintore Street. Thanks for the work that's gone into responding to the neighbours' concerns about the proposed development. Reading the prepared documents has been informative, and as someone who's never been involved in these sort of civic things, I'm learning lots. My concerns may slightly be beyond your remit, but I'm here, so here we go. I remain concerned about the effects of the proposed size and bulk of the dwelling in reducing open green space and reducing permeable surfaces, which are critical for supporting biodiversity in our region. The urban heat island effects concern me. The birds and the butterflies and the bees will not thrive if all of our neighbourhoods prioritise built environments over green space. These can have flow-on effects for all of our well-being, including the children that will grow up in the neighbourhoods. I'd like the council to reconcile for me what seems to be an incompatibility between a really good urban, environmentally sustainable development principles, the Boroondara Climate Action Plan, which sensibly references the need for backyard biodiversity projects and increasing Boroondara's tree canopy, and how these important factors are at odds with the planning permit process, which only considers heritage on developments over 500 square metres. I think that tree canopy coverage is more than just the very large protected trees, and in the case of 6 Kintore Street, it's more than 15 medium-sized trees, many shrubs and flowering plants that will be lost, and that green space is reduced and covered up with a built environment. And I feel like I'd love to see more leadership and foresight from local council if Boroondara is to remain a desirable place to live, contributing within its means to take intelligent actions to reduce the destruction of climate change. Because I think taking progressive action is everyone's responsibility, and those with greater means to impact the environment should take greater responsibility for protecting it.
Thank you, Ms Rowland. No questions? There are none. Thank you. You may return to the gallery. Next presenter this evening, Mr Deakin, if you can come forward, followed by Ms Jane Oldman. Thank you, Mr Deakin. If we can commence with your name and your suburb and your presentation.
Greg Deakin. I live in Broadway, just round the corner from this application. The application to develop 6 Kintore Street is very similar to another recent application at 69 Broadway, which was 2 years ago. Both dwellings are graded as significant houses within the precinct HO 159. Both applications involved significant demolition of original fabric at the rear of the building, including elements of the roof, in order to graft a modern two-storey structure on the back of the house. In both cases, destruction of the original material was not to conserve the building, but to diminish it so as to accommodate expansive new interior spaces. In both cases, the modern structure would be clearly visible from the street at different angles, although the applications asserted otherwise. The council refused the application for 69 Broadway outright. The decision went to VCAT and was ably defended by council with support from local residents. VCAT also refused the application. Yet, in this case, 6 Kintore Street, a significant heritage house, we have a similar application supported by council's heritage advisor, saying that the extent of demolition proposed is okay, the scale is okay, the materiality is sympathetic, and the design outcomes are just fine. What has gone wrong in this case? The report states clearly that the criteria applied in this application are all about heritage. It leans heavily on advice from the heritage advisor engaged by council. It ignores planning scheme requirements in relation to preservation of heritage places, i.e. protecting all significant heritage fabric, including elements that cannot be seen from the public realm. Let's look at some of these things a little more closely. For a significant heritage place, we're required to retain significant built fabric and not normally allow demolition. The heritage advisor improvises on the planning scheme by declaring that the triple gabled bay windows at the front and the side of the building and the return veranda are significant fabric, and everything else is contributory fabric. On this basis, she approves the demolition of a significant amount of original fabric, including walls, windows and the roof towards the rear. Second point about the planning scheme, partial demolition of significant built fabric is okay for the purpose of additions and alterations only if the partial demolition, etc., will not adversely affect the cultural heritage significance of the place and will assist in the long-term conservation of the building. So what we've been given is a plan to do some tuck pointing and paint removal on the front of the building. This has nothing to do with the demolition issue. On the visibility from the street, I think, I've lost track of the slide. That's not the wrong slide. That's that one, yes, the next one.
I'm going to ask you, you need to wrap up your presentation, Mr. Deakin.
So,
if you can be quick.
I'll finish with another quote from the report. The additions will not dominate the subject site nor the broader streetscape. In fact, they will be less dominant than other additions within the immediate area. This is clearly not true and reflects a bias in favour of a modernist approach to the issues that is not honest in protecting heritage. This application should be refused outright, and this particular heritage advisor should be sacked before she does any more damage.
I'm going to close off your... just be careful, Mr Deakin, not to offend any people with your comments.
Chair, I think that last comment was absolutely outrageous, and the presenter ought to be asked to withdraw that comment. That's not acceptable in this chamber.
Mr Deakin, are you happy to withdraw your comment?
I'm not happy to withdraw that comment at all. I think that...
Then he ought not be heard further.
There are no lights on, Mr Deakin. You may return to the gallery. Thank you. Our next presenter this evening, Miss Jane Oldham. If you can come forward. Thank you, Miss Oldham. And following Miss Oldham, Mr Wilkie. Sorry, Ms Muirden, you're actually speaking on behalf of Ms Jane Oldham.
Yes, I'm not Jane Oldham.
No, you're definitely not. Thank you.
I'm Nerida, but Jane unfortunately couldn't come tonight, so I'm reading her speech for her, if that's okay.
No problems.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, good evening. As a resident of the Prospect Hill Road precinct, I am concerned that the extent of demolition and the additions will regrade this significant graded home and the precinct generally. It is not an appropriate heritage outcome for an individually significant home with 2 multi-gabled bay rooms designed by John Beswick. This proposal includes demolition of 2 original rooms to the rear, almost 30% of original roof fabric running north-south, and various external doors and windows. To justify this large amount, the Heritage Advisor took a unique approach advising roof fabric could be demolished as it did not affect the significance of the Beswickian gables, and the remaining fabric could be demolished as it could not be seen from the street and was not explicitly mentioned in the Statement of Significance. This approach is inconsistent with Council's heritage policy, normal heritage practice, and Heritage Council guidelines. At VCAT last year for another significant place at 69 Broadway, Council's advocate and its heritage expert established, and the member accepted, that a significant grading is a grading for the entire place. All original fabric is significant. The objective of Burundara's Heritage Policy, Clause 15.03, is unequivocal in its intention to protect all of 6 Kintore. The objective reads, to preserve significant heritage places, protecting all significant heritage fabric, including elements that cannot be seen from the public realm. It is also a requirement of Burundara's Heritage Policy for partial demolition of significant fabric to assist the long-term conservation of the building. This requirement is clearly not met at 6 Kintore. Despite the Heritage Advisor's report, I respectfully assert that Council's heritage policy does not support the demolition proposed. Allowing such demolition would put at risk original fabric at significant places across Burundara. The Statement of Significance for the sub-precinct says, the area has a high level of visual cohesion and period expression deriving from its consistency of scale, form, materials and siting. The proposed additions are inconsistent with that. Much has been made of the 2 neighbouring properties having a second storey. However, the proposed is substantially different to those neighbouring in 3 ways. 1, the additions will be visible from the street. 2, the proposed will be significantly higher than the roof forms of the original home. And 3, it will be closer to the side boundary than the original. By being built closer, both the ground floor and second floor additions will not only be visible, they will degrade the visual cohesion and thus the significance of the place and its contribution to the sub-precinct. They are not in keeping the character of the neighbourhood. As a significant graded place, impact of this degradation and departure from neighbourhood character is elevated. Thank you.
Well done. Spot on 3 minutes. Thanks, Ms Muirden. Okay. Councillors, any questions? There being none, thank you. May you return to the gallery. Mr Wilkie, thank you. If you can come forward. And followed by Mr Wilkie will be Mr Mears. Thank you, Mr Wilkie. If you can
Good evening. My name is Peter Wilkie and I live at number 1 Waterloo Street. And recently, a couple of months ago, we sold number 11 Broadway, which is probably 200 metres from Kintore Street from this development. And as the owner of Waterloo Street and Broadway, I've never really felt myself to be the owner of the house. I've felt that I was a custodian of the home. And I've handed 11 Broadway... Now, I'm a registered commercial and domestic builder. I've got to make that clear. And I've handed Broadway back undamaged to the next custodian of the house. And the previous owners of 6 Kintore Street have also handed it over undamaged to the next owner. And as I think the heritage overlay has been in operation, I think for over 30 years, and most owners in the precinct have bought under those conditions, and they know the responsibility that comes with owning a home in the heritage overlay. And especially if it's significant, there aren't all that many significant homes in there. And it's a warning when you buy a property, it's a warning to builders and purchasers. Hang on, this is a significant home. It comes with responsibilities that can detract also from the sale price. It can devalue the property, or it can, a family may want to buy, wow, we really love the heritage nature and we want to preserve it. And I spent 4 days on Zoom during the COVID, where at number 4 Waterloo Street, the new owner it had a Queen's Counsel, it's now King's Counsellor, and a bunch of experts trying to explain for 4 days why a contemporary development like that fits into our heritage overlay. And 4 days of hearing how that actually works, it was a long process, and the councillors, the council people there, it probably cost $200,000 all up. And the answer, when that was knocked back by VCAT, was the starting point for any design response would be an understanding of this broader heritage setting, but also the immediate context of the site, and the context should generally seek to adopt the scale, massing, setbacks and forms of elements that contribute to the significance of the heritage place. Now that cost $200,000 and a lot of effort. And I think everybody should realise that's a precedent now, and that's the law, and I think everybody should take note that that's the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkie. No questions? And you may return to the gallery, thank you. Our next speaker, Mr. Mears. Thank you, Mr. Mears. And following Mr. Mears is Mr. David Neal. Thank you. We'll just turn that on. Thank you, Mr. Mears. If
Thank
we
you.
can commence with your name and your suburb. And
Simon Mears, Camberwell. I support the application with all conditions. Thanks for the opportunity to address the council tonight. I'd especially like to thank the Planning Officer and Heritage Advisor who have provided such an extensive report and given us history of the property. We value heritage architecture and we value the heritage streetscape, and we feel privileged to be in a position to restore this home. For this reason, we engaged an architectural firm that specialises in heritage architecture and a private town planning consultant with extensive heritage experience. We also consulted our immediate neighbours on each side and on the opposite side of the street, and where requested, we've provided them with additional information, including views and shadowing information. The immediate neighbours have responded positively and no one has objected to the project. There are also 50 residences in Kintore Street and we don't have any objections within our street. Our initial proposal received a positive response from the Heritage Advisor, commenting that the colour palette and the material proposed were preferred, and described the linking of the heritage of the existing house and the proposed addition as heritage best practice. The Heritage Advisor did request that we review the overall height of the addition. It's worth noting that the original proposal was already significantly lower than the maximum height allowable by council and the code. However, we worked positively with that request. Our architects were able to make some significant changes, lowering the overall height by 900 millimetres, lowering the linking element between the existing and new structure by 1 metre, and shifting the ridge line of the roof by some 3.5 metres to the west. The proposed addition is not a box on the back of the house. It has an offset pitched roof, which in the original design was offset to the east. The architects flipped that design and offset the pitch to the west, which gave the effect of moving the property further back behind the original home. It's also worth noting that our proposed addition is lower than both neighbours at number 4 and number 8 on either side of us, who both have second-storey additions. A key requirement for us with our architects is to ensure that we capture northern sunlight into the living spaces to ensure maximum environmental benefit and livability of the spaces. Our property has a south-facing rear yard, so you cannot just put an extension on the back and put up a wall of glass. This, in our case, would attract no environmental benefit and, in fact, would do the opposite. So while the lowering of the proposed addition and the reorientation of the roof pitch is not perhaps our preferred design, we've been prepared to make these compromises, and our architect believes we can still achieve our desired outcomes. We also wanted off-street parking via a rear garage, so that in the future we'll be able to charge electric vehicles. While we have considered off-street parking in the front, we felt this would detract from the heritage streetscape, and we understand that rear parking is council preference. We welcome the Planning Officer's recommendations of tuck pointing and paint removal to the original render. This has always been part of our intent for the restoration works. We understand that there will always be different opinions on what is considered appropriate. For this reason, we engaged consultants with extensive knowledge and expertise in this area and have worked positively with Council, Heritage Advisor and the Town Planning Officer throughout this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Mears. Councillors, any questions of the owner? Yes, we do. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much. I've just got a query. I think you said the plan was to have off-street parking. Do you not have it at the moment?
No, we don't. We've only got on-street parking.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Any further questions, councillors? There being none. Mr Mears, thank you for your presentation. Our last presenter this evening, councillors, is Mr David Neal, I believe the design architect. Mr Neal, if we can commence with your name and your company and your 3-minute presentation. We'll just turn on your speaker as well.
Hello, thank you for the opportunity to speak briefly. My name is David Neal. I'm one of the directors of Neal Architecture in Richmond. Simon has largely covered the background of this story, but Simon and Sarah originally came to us to design and the plans for their home in Camberwell. We're renowned as architects that do work on heritage homes throughout Stonington and Burundara and Yarra in particular. And we've got a practice where we regard these heritage homes and work closely with heritage architects and council heritage advisors to achieve the best possible outcome, we believe, for the area and also for the clients. At the outset of this project, we considered site context and orientation and also engaged with arborists in relation to large established trees that we're needing to keep. So there are many factors that were considered at the outset of working on this project, and in particular northern orientation and light and not overshining the backyard was something which was important to our client. I believe that throughout this process we've shown that we're willing to compromise on heights and also listen and work in closely with heritage to achieve hopefully what will be a great outcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Neal. Councillors, any questions? There being none, I'll turn to officers on matters arising.
Thank you, Mr Chair. We've heard tonight a lot about the Council's heritage policy, and in some submissions, some of the policy wasn't read in full. The policy does contemplate that you can demolish or partly alter significant graded buildings. To say and impose a heritage overlay and grade it significant and to say that you can't do anything to your home whatsoever is certainly not in the spirit of applying the heritage overlay guidelines. So specifically, the policy says permit partial demolition of significant built fabric for the purpose of additions and alterations only if the partial demolition, additions and alterations will not adversely affect the cultural heritage significance of the place and will assist in the long-term conservation of the building. So in this regard, Council's Heritage Advisor has looked at the statement of significance for this site, noting that the bay window at the front of the site and to the side are the most significant components of the application or the subject site, and then applied the test of if we are allowing demolition alterations to rear and side components, how visible and what will that impact be on the heritage precinct and the streetscape in general. We've heard some submissions tonight with regards to the built form in the laneway. Council's heritage policy puts a lot of emphasis on impact on the streetscape, and that is the primary streetscape, Kintore Street in this regard. Going down the laneway, you will see a combination of built form elements. There are outbuildings onto laneways. You'll see high fences, and you'll also get garden. To this effect, the subject site proposes or stacks the development towards the eastern tidal boundary so that one half of the rear yard is more intensely developed than the other. They do retain a 10-metre high tree in their secluded private open space, as well as a number of other trees scattered throughout the yard. In terms of one of the submissions noted about minimum garden area and not being complied with, under the building regulations, they will need to comply with the minimum garden area. We've done our calculations that the site coverage is approximately 38%. Under building regulations, it is possible to go to 60% site coverage. Similarly, we're not assessing permeability as part of this planning application, as it doesn't relate to heritage, but on a site of 1,042 square metres, permeability and site coverage ought to be complied with. In terms of precedent, we've heard a number of different applications being cited in the heritage precinct, not just Kintore Street, but we heard examples from Cookson Street and Broadway in particular, VCAT cases. But each and every one of those applications have got different site controls, different significant features, and different site contexts. So it's not possible to draw examples. They're not straight correlations between the two. In terms of the comment with regards to this particular application being higher than both adjoining properties, this is not the case. Council records show number 8 Kintore Street as having an RL of 78.47 and number 4 Kintore being 78.2 and 6 is 78.34, so 14 centimetres higher than the lower one. I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Ray. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? Councillor Parker.
Just one, and I'm sure there's a simple explanation, but the previous application we dealt with required electronic copies and an unlocked PDF. This one requires 3, presumably hard copies. I'm just intrigued about why.
Councillor Parker, we are paperless in our office, so any way that we get the plans, we will be processing those electronically using PDFs. So I'm not too sure where the conditions came from, but it's the same. They need to submit plans with an update.
Right. It was curiously that paragraph 1, which is otherwise the same in effect, but is written differently. Perhaps planning could standardise its wording, but so does that then mean that this should read the same way as the other one? That is, that it's plans must be drawn to scale with dimensions and electronic copies provided in brackets unlocked PDF. Is that what we mean to say here?
We could add those words in if that was particularly necessary. Statutory Planning has commenced a project to actually consolidate all of our conditions because we've got thousands of them, and there are some variations.
Yeah, okay. It just seems to me that they need to be consistent, so thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Park. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. My query relates to the demolition I haven't measured it, but do we have any sense the percentage? Because it actually doesn't look anywhere near 20% to me. And then, is it based on percentage, or is it more the degree to which it will, and I know this is sort of a value judgment, hinder the heritage value of the property?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Addis. The extent of demolition is not a percentage. Unlike some controls in planning, heritage is a lot subjective based and value judgment, so we don't have a percentage. We've heard tonight that somewhere between 20 and 30. I'm not too sure that that is the case. More particularly and more importantly, it's more important about looking at what elements are being demolished and is it visible from the streetscape and is it significant fabric, and our policy tells us to do that.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Councillors, any further questions? Councillor Sinfield, and I've got Councillor Bigger.
Thanks, Chair. Ms Ray, I'm wondering if you might be able to reread the sentence that you read at the very beginning in relation to policy and what alterations can be done to individually significant properties. It's just the last sort of 4 or 5 words I'd like to rehear, please.
Whilst that's coming, Ms Ray, would you... Oh, we'll wait.
Thank you. So this second line of the significant heritage places strategies is permit partial demolition of significant built fabric for the purpose of additions and alterations only if the partial demolition, additions and alterations will not adversely affect the cultural heritage significance of the place and will assist in the long-term conservation of the building.
Follow up, if I may. So, in your opinion, will this assist in the long-term conservation of this property?
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. I certainly do think the demolition, the small demolition, will allow the owners of the site to extend their house in a form that is separate from the host building. That is to provide a double-storey rear addition that is separate from the original fabric, and that enables the old and the new to have a transition between the two and live forever, well, live for a long time forthcoming.
Thank you, Ms Ray. As a point of clarification, though, if I might just double back, the wording was to preserve conservation, the last 3 or 4 words?
The long-term conservation of the building.
Are you able to explain a little bit more about what the intent of that bit is? I'm not convinced, and I'm seeking to be convinced that it is to allow long-term habitation of the property or something like that, but conservation of the heritage fabric, I'm not quite sure matches with what has just been explained.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the long-term conservation, this is a family home and the owners presumably want to upgrade it to modern-day living by allowing them a transitional zone and a new building that enables them to expand their family home. We still get the original building to be retained, where as part of a condition, or 3 conditions on permit, we're actually getting the original facade restored, and it is possible that future generations can live in the site, so we see that that's a long-term conservation of the building.
Thanks, Ms Ray. Thanks, Chair.
Mr Chair, if I might just add to that, I think one of the important components here is that Council's Heritage Advisor, in making an assessment of this proposal, is saying that they are comfortable with the demolition and then additions to the rear of this building, and that supports this significant building and supports the ongoing relationship that this building has to the site and to the surrounding area. So I think the heritage advice in assessing the demolition components and the additions that are proposed is particularly important here in informing a view on this particular clause.
Just on that, Mr Walker, is it consistent with the Borough Charter?
Through yourself, yes, it would be.
Thank you. I have Councillor Bigger, followed by Councillor Franco. You had your light on?
The question's just been answered by Ms Ray. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bigger.
Yeah, I am still pondering that answer because, you were clearly saying that it is can demolish only if A and B, correct, in that phrase, meaning we need to be certain that it will not adversely affect the cultural significance of the property and it will assist in long-term conservation of the property. And you're saying that in your view, or the Heritage Advisor's view, both have been met?
That's correct.
And you would also say that both are subjective, clearly?
Yes, correct. But we have got qualified heritage architects looking at the application in addition to town planners that are quite experienced.
And if I could, just to go back to the demolition, I think in the report we used the word, it's similar, I know, to a question that was asked previously, but I'm still trying to understand about, we use the word minor to describe the demolition, but that's not a prescriptive term, that is just a value judgment.
Correct. You could interchange it with lots of other words, like some demolition, as an example. It's an attempt to quantify the demolition in the absence of a calculation that we've spoken about previously.
Right. Thank you. And just to go, I suppose, to what at least Liz Burton, I think one other might have mentioned, the question really relating to, I'm not sure that you responded to, or I missed it maybe, but about the division of a property that is individually significant effectively into contributory and significant parts. Is that a standard approach to do that, or is that just something that our advisor has done in this particular circumstance?
That sentence about permitting partial demolition that I've read out half a dozen times goes to that issue that the significant built fabric that's in the opening line has been identified as the bay windows, John Beswick designed windows, and then it talks about for the purpose of additions and alterations, so we know the house is being extended. Then the policy then goes to will not adversely affect the cultural heritage significance. And that's where our heritage advisor has gone to, are the demolition or components of demolition visible from the street? And that's the same test as a contributory graded building. So it's not that the heritage advisor has necessarily, and has been expressed to make it easier to understand and unpack that policy position.
Thank you. I just have one final question, Ms. Ray, and that's just about whether you described the impact that the primary focus of the impact has been on the impact that it would have on Kintore Street, and as opposed to the laneway. But I presume also attention was given to the impact on Victoria Road, and I just wonder whether you could speak to whether or not it will be whether or not the back large extension will be quite visible to Victoria Road. My understanding is it would be.
Yeah, certainly buildings are always seen in the round. When we're walking down the streetscape, we see buildings from different vantage points, but the policy actually calls for 3 particular locations in the streetscape, and that is on either side of the property boundaries and out the front. So that's your primary view, and then some of the other objectives in the heritage policy, like bulk and dominance and those sort of adjectives, are then considered from other locations, but as I said, the primary policy is from those 3 locations in the primary street frontage.
Sorry, I promise this is the last one. So dominance could be, for instance, considered whether it's dominant on the scape from the back road, for instance, from Victoria Road, that's something that would be considered?
Yes, I would certainly count. I would say that 60 metres from Victoria Street, a double-storey built form at 7.24 metres cannot be dominant.
Okay,
Thank you. I've got our CEO.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I just wanted to perhaps test the question being raised by Councillor Sinfield and Councillor Biggar by asking it in a slightly different way. This is a very important issue for councillors, and I think it's important that whatever choice is made on a well-informed basis. So I guess I'd be interested, Ms Ray, in hearing you address the question the other way around, which is that if the extension did not go ahead, how would the existing fabric suffer from a conservation point of view? So what would be lost? Are we facing the prospect of this building no longer being able to be habitable or serve a purpose for family accommodation? What's actually going to be lost if this extension is not approved?
Thank you, Mr Storer. So there's a number of different combinations that could occur in relation to the redevelopment of this site. So first of all, there might be no redevelopment, and therefore the living conditions might remain those as constructed in 1901. The second model might be that a different development comes along before council, and they actually seek to put a first floor extension on the original fabric. And that's what both adjoining properties have done. They've extended their homes and actually put part of their first floor on top of the original built form. So Council's Heritage Advisor has put a little bit of emphasis on the fact that there is that transitional space, that kitchen annex area that provides that transition between the old and the new.
Thank you, Mr Storer. I'll turn back to councillors. Councillor Gold.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask the question, if we approve the demolition of a portion of this building and the construction of an extension, does this in any way, shape or form put the original house at risk? My apologies if the conditions that are going through my mind at the moment are quite different. It's a different overlay situation, but I seem to remember one that came before us probably last year of a rather wonderful Edwardian dwelling, and we concluded that it had been altered at the rear and something else had been built, so it wasn't intact anymore, so we could not stop its demolition. And we've all had pictures recently of that house now totally demolished. Is this potentially a step that would allow the Beswick house eventually to be demolished at a second step? Not that it's intended, but does it put it at risk in the longer term?
Through yourself, Chair, and perhaps if I can answer that question, perhaps it picks up on a couple of other points that are being made, and we're perhaps skirting around one of the key points here. This is a significant investment in this property by the owner of the property. They are undertaking renovations and extensions to the building with the intent of that consolidating this site and this building for the future to come. And that's a significant approach and significant effort. It's not a scenario that's going to lead to a change or demolition of this building in the near future as a result of that investment. The judgment of Council's Heritage Advisor in providing advice on this is that that's an appropriate demolition and extension to this building, and that will support and reinforce the significant heritage fabric of the primary building. And that's the conclusion that's been reached by Council's Heritage Advisor and then the officers in their assessment in this report.
Can I just make a quick comment in relation to that? I thank you very much for that. We are seeing a trend within...
Question or comment? Sorry, Councillor Gold, if you've got a question.
The question, is it reasonable to assume that this is a long-term development, and are we not seeing within Boroondara extensions to houses that are 10, 15 or 20 years old, now being demolished for even bigger extensions.
I think there was more comment than question. Mr. Walker.
I'm not going to predict 15, 20 years into the future.
If I can just rephrase Councillor Galt's question, the extension does in no means diminish the heritage value of the individual significant property. Is that the case?
Correct.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any other questions? There appears to be no lights on, so I'm in search of a motion. Councillors. Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to propose an alternative motion which I would ask officers to put on the screen, please.
And can you just, for the benefit of the gallery, Councillor Gillies, could you do a précis on your motion?
Basically, it is in opposition to the officer's position. It's the proposal that I'm putting forward is to not approve the permit request.
A refusal motion?
It's a refusal. Thank you.
To assist Councillor Gillies, is there a seconder on this?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Again, to assist Councillor Gillies, is there opposition? Thank you. Councillor Gillies, as the mover of the motion, do you wish to speak to your motion? Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. We've heard a lot of community members and neighbours express concerns which I share. I think we all know that the bar required for a property to be granted individually significant status is a very high one. And 6 Kintore Street in the Tara Estate does hold that status. Apart from the technical criteria for attaining that sort of recognition, there are many other aspects, including the fact that this property is the result of the exemplary work of John Beswick. And I know we've heard that emphasis is placed on specific parts of that design, but nevertheless, the status applies to the whole property. Significance of the location. Again, these things are balanced with a range of views, and they're not hard and fast science, we know that. But this property has a context in one of the most outstanding streets, in one of Burundarra's most outstanding intact heritage precincts. Even those houses around that have had extensions are largely in sympathy with heritage character. I'm also not quite convinced that the visibility issue has been fully explored when we talk about the public realm, not just from the frontage of Kintore Street. And I understand that we've looked at in detail some of the clauses, but I really highlight those words regarding protecting significant heritage fabric, including elements that are not visible from the public realm. And secondly, incorporating design details that complement the design of a heritage place. Interpretive, yes, honestly admit their modernity, but key words here are while relating to the heritage character of their surroundings or are a replica of historic forms and detailing. I note with thanks, though, that the applicants indicated they'll undertake some restoration work at the front, some reinstating of tuck pointing and some paint removal. That's nice, but I personally can't see that that offsets the work that is being done at the back. I have to note that the applicant already has a local laws permit to remove trees, so whilst I sympathise with residents expressing concerns about yet another loss of permeable surfacing and trees, that's not a matter for this application. So whilst our officers and consultants advise us regarding the technical and the regulatory compliances, we as councillors have a responsibility to listen to our wider community too. And I'm confident that all my colleagues have heard for some time now the growing urgency and the alarm bells that our community are raising over what does heritage protection really mean and built form design. So I believe in our role as custodians of one of Melbourne's earliest, most intact and indeed probably most precious heritage streets and a property within that holds individually significant status. I urge you to listen to the community's expectations of where the cumulative effects of such applications take us and to support this motion of refusal. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. I have another speaker, Councillor Franco.
Thank you. I do not support the motion to refuse this application. I support the application and the officer's recommendation, and should this motion fail, I will happily move the officer's recommendation. I make the point, I just want to make a few points. Firstly, we've heard many people in the gallery speak about heritage conservation. My motive in not supporting this is because I do strongly support heritage conservation. I'm very much in support of heritage conservation, and that's what we have before us. I think it's worth being absolutely clear that the application is about the long-term conservation of the significant heritage fabric. The rear extension is detached effectively or stylistically from the significant heritage fabric, and it's done so in a successful way. This ensures that we can retain to a high degree of intactness the heritage, the significant component, while allowing the owner to redevelop the rear in a contemporary modern manner. And I think understanding the principles of heritage conservation, contemporary understanding of what heritage is, this is what we're doing. The alternative, if sympathetic means a faux heritage extension, a first floor extension in faux heritage form that mimics, I mean, that's potentially the alternative, and that is not good. That's not a good outcome. This is actually a good outcome for our community, and I applaud what's being presented before us, because the alternative, that alternative, which is what we could have, is not a good outcome. And an understanding of heritage and the principles behind that would be lost if we go down such a path or encourage such a path. And I'm pleased that Council's policy does allow and promote extensions that honestly admit the modernity and contrast that. I also think it's worth making a point about what's being done here in terms of architectural design. The owner and the architect have sought to facilitate natural light. As a council, we've taken a policy stance, which I disagree with, about opposing solar panels in heritage precincts that are visible from the street. Now here we have the owner saying, I don't need necessarily solar panels, or they don't have to be visible, it's a separate point, but they're trying to engage with contemporary design principles to allow passive forms of environmental performance and facilitate natural light in a very sympathetic way. And again, this is being, by some, looked down upon. I think actually this is the sort of design we need to embrace and the sort of principles we need to embrace. In relation to some comments were made about the loss of open space and green space, and I share those, but that's a broader issue and a policy issue that's outside this. Look, I'll leave it there. I'm prepared to move the officer's recommendation, and I think the officer's recommendation is well thought through and will actually contribute to the long-term conservation of the significant heritage fabric. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillors, are there any other speakers on this item? Councillor Sinfield, followed by Councillor Addis.
Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Gold.
The integrity of a Beswick property is of the utmost importance to me. This isn't any old house. This isn't any old house in Camberwell. This is a, as I learnt tonight, Beswickian property. I like that, new word in my vocabulary. I'll see how many times I can use it in the next sentence. No, I'm just joking. I appreciate the submission by the community member earlier in relation to being a custodian of a property, and I think that's a really important point that we should not lose hold of. It's not just about the addition to the rear of this property. It's about the integrity of the property, because it goes hand in hand with all of the other changes that are happening to the internals of this property as well. So it's the integrity of the whole. Now, I understand the policy position on all of these changes and the addition and so forth, but the point that I made earlier and asked officers to re-emphasise in relation to the conservation of the property, I think is an important one. And I understand the other position that extending this will permit its ongoing use as a modern family home, but this is a Beswick property. This is a very special part of our community and it should be cherished the way it is. And if the owners didn't like the house, then perhaps they shouldn't have bought it, or perhaps they should give it to another custodian. I bought a house that was too small for me. That's on me, right? It's up to me to either move house or change where I live or change the circumstances. This is a Beswick property and it should be cherished as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. And next councillor to speak is Councillor Addis, followed by Councillor Gold.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I certainly agree this is a precious old house. There's no doubt about it. But I think we have to allow people who take on what are inevitably the joys and traumas of owning these special old houses to do what they need to do to make them fit for modern living. And a number of us in the chamber own probably rather similar houses to this, and each one of us in our own ways have made changes to try and make them suit the sorts of lives we want to live. And I'm sure people looking at mine, some of them say, I don't like what you've done, but, you know, I conformed with what I was told were the heritage requirements in my own way, as do the rest of us in this chamber. We've all done different things to try and preserve, particularly the street view of these old houses. Now, when I turn my mind to this one in particular, there are two aspects that I am particularly thinking about, and the first one is whether the demolition proposed is excessive. The way I judge that is whether the demolition substantially hinders the heritage quality of the building. And I know it's a subjective judgment, but I don't think it does. I think the important heritage fabric remains. And the second bit is what is proposed acceptable. And while I find it discordant, it isn't what I do. This isn't about my taste, it's about what the heritage guidelines will allow. And everything I've heard says that, yes, they do allow this, and for reasons that seem perfectly valid. So, no, it isn't what I do, and no, I don't particularly like it, but I think it's a legitimate choice that these owners have made to live in a modern house. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Addis. Our next speaker, Councillor Gold.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to pick up a couple of points from the presentations that have been made tonight. To say that the other alternative is to do a faux extension is to the other end of the scale. There's a whole range of architectural solutions between a faux extension and what we have here. And I refer back to one of the first words I want to address tonight, which is complementary. What is added to the back of one of these wonderful old houses is meant to be complementary. I do agree it's set well back. I do agree it's coloured to be regressive and picks up colours from the front dwelling. But there I find the complementarity disappears. I can see little effort to blend this in or be complementary. I'm not saying mimic, but none of the roof angles match, none of the scales match, none of the bulk matches. The other word I want to pick up is link. And we've had many links proposed in buildings, linking old with new, and they're often luminous, light, low-key, etc., to blend the two things together. In this case, when I looked at the plans for this, I probably would have described the link as, hey, look at me. It doesn't bear any relationship to the functionality of the kitchen. It's a very spiky sculptural form. And just the third point I want to make is I understand, and you've explained very well tonight, thank you, the sightline assessments that you do make, and I do understand this. But there's no getting around that this extension is visible from the street and is very visible and has little to match it to or be complementary with the existing Beswickian dwelling. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Galt. Next speaker, Councillor Stavrou.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Look, I've been sort of listening to the discussion, and I certainly have heard what the officers have said and what the heritage advisors have said, and very sympathetic to the views of Councillor Sinfield, Councillor Galt's clarification, but also Councillor Adder's describing it as perhaps not what she would do, but to give the owners the benefit that that's something they might do, and whether we should be restricting that. But there's a couple of things. One is the intervention. The intervention, I can't get around the fact that that is a very large intervention, meaning then that the proposed structure as an intervention on an existing heritage building is very difficult to get around in terms of it not matching. Whether I'm saying this in a technical term, of course not. It is a subjective term, and we've heard from even the heritage recommendation advice tends to be subjective. But I think Councillor Galt said it in terms of the range between a for heritage design versus something that we see here. But I would go a little bit different to that, and that's sort of where I was helped to be firmed in that way was Mr. Wilkie in saying how he was a custodian. And we should never forget that, you know, heritage and the attractiveness of buildings is to do with past and future taste and what people see as appropriate. We can't, you know, if these owners don't like the way that this house is, in whatever way, whether the size of it, whether the structure of it, there may be others, and we should allow that plurality to actually allow itself to play out in the preservation of heritage. And it's not only the act that we should see the defender of heritage, because in the end of the day, there will be subjective parts to it that will not be able to tell us which way to go. Having said that, I think there will be sympathetic owners that would like a house like that. I certainly think it's a very attractive house, and they would preserve it. And I didn't hear that not doing what is proposed is going to detract from the house, its ability to be preserved in the future. And sort of trying to synthesize all that, I would side on the side that, on balance, I would not like to see this proceed.
Thank you, Councillor Stavrou. Next speaker is Councillor Parker.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Franco has foreshadowed that if this motion fails, he'll move the officer's recommendation, and that's also my position. I'll support that should this motion fail. I think some are labouring under the misapprehension that such an extension needs to match in. Well, clearly it doesn't need to do so. I find it interesting that people with perhaps the very best of intentions make submissions and are very vocal about what others do with their private property. And it's easy to do that when you don't have to reach into your own pocket and fund that. As somebody who has reached into his own pocket and funded to the extent of about $3 million restoration of a significant graded residence in Burundara, one that had been neglected for probably 50 to 60 years, had been bastardised in the 1950s with glazing and building in of areas that were previously external, to purchase a property that the roof was shot. It was 110 years old. The guttering was shot. There'd been structural modifications done that rendered parts of the structure likely to fail. It had been dreadfully neglected, and the very nature of conservation was what was touched on earlier by the officer in responding to questions. One doesn't find people who are willing to just reach into their pockets and restore a museum. It has to be a house. It has to be a place that works. Now, it's all about balance, but it's not for us to substitute our own personal preferences, likes and dislikes upon someone else. We work within a framework, and that's what we ought to do. And in the circumstances, the officer recommendation, it just makes sense. And I don't see how we can depart from that.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Councillor Bigger.
Yeah, thank you. I guess for me, many of the extremes that are being mentioned here seem to be unhelpful. The idea that if we don't approve this particular application, the house might be demolished somewhere down the track, or we might get a worse application, we might get a faux application, things that could seem much worse, but they're not actually in front of us tonight. And we're not actually meant to be thinking about the future and what might happen if we don't do that. I think we're meant to look at what we have in front of us. And yes, we do have a Heritage Advisor's view on this, and we have the guidelines of what will be allowed. But I think, as we often talk about, there is still another element to that, which is our subjective application of what we understand of our community, what we understand of these neighbourhoods, and of what we understand of what is in keeping with this neighbourhood. And certainly when I walked this street, I don't live on the street, I don't live too far from there, but I don't live on the street, but when I walked that street, and did again today, I don't see anything that looks like this extension. And even just what we would see of it. It's hard to tell that other houses have a second story. I just cannot get past this idea that this is going to, the concept that this might be in keeping or in fitting with this, the streetscape as it stands. And I think, you know, we know that precedent is relevant here. And so I think that I would absolutely agree with Councillor Sinfield on this Beswickian house deserving to be protected and carefully custodianed into its future. I just made a word. So I would encourage my fellow councillors to support Councillor Gillies' recommendation on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bigger. Are there any further speakers on this item? There being none, I'll return to our mover, Councillor Gillies, to round out debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I don't think for a minute we should be considering this motion in light of what alternatives could come. That is completely abstract and irrelevant. Thank you, Councillor Bigger, for highlighting that. That really is not what is in front of us. And should any future proposals for this property or any others, I would assume they will be judged on their merits. So I do not see that as an influencing factor here. I would note that there are many heritage building features that actually exemplify good environmental design. High ceilings, facings, many features. Old houses are not necessarily, by definition, poor environmental structures at all. The integrity of the design is a topic that's been raised. This is something I don't object outrightly at all to adapting old houses to live in this modern day and our lives' expectations. I live in one. But I do believe in the collective custodial role, and I don't believe that anyone is suggesting here that a proposal would need to match the style of the individually significant house. But what I would seek is more sympathy with character. And I know that that is achievable. Our two words of the debate tonight that really I think we'll end our debate on is Beswickian and custodianship. So thank you, Chair. I will leave my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you, councillors. I'll now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? We have a tied vote, councillors, which means I, as chair, I've got a casting vote. On the basis that this motion has failed to get unanimous support, the convention is this motion fails. So therefore, I'm declaring that this motion fails. So, councillors, I'm in search of a new motion. Councillor Franco?
I'm prepared to move the officer's recommendation.
And Councillor Park?
Happy to second that, Chair.
Thank you. To assist Councillor Franco, is there any opposition on this item? It's going to be a fun night this evening, councillors, because we do need to make a decision one way or another. So I'll move to you, Councillor Franco, to speak to your motion.
Look, I think the debate's been had. I'll make the point that it's just because we ended on this, that we're not debating this, but what might presumably happen in the future. It's really about what's before us and the merit of the application before us. I'll leave it there.
Do any other councillors wish to speak to this item? Councillor Gillies.
Simply to reinforce the comments I've already made. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you. I'd like to quote a former colleague in this chamber. Once it's gone, it's gone. Be that part or all of the dwelling that is the subject of our debate tonight, the integrity of this property will be compromised. And if you can sleep at night knowing that as the custodian of this municipality at this time, as a councillor here in this chamber, that you can pass this on your head.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Watson.
I wasn't going to speak, but I'll keep my remarks brief. It complies. And passing judgment on the design about whether you do or don't like it, whether you do or don't think it has aesthetic merit, or whether it complements, it still complies. And I think that it is, we are failing in our duty to make a decision and hoiking it off to another place, to VCAT, to potentially make that decision. Our officers have been in full consultation with residents and with the applicant and have come to a number of different compromises on design to be able to achieve compliance with the rules and also to satisfy concerns of adjoining properties. So I will leave my remarks there and commend this motion to my fellow councillors.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I have Councillor Bigger next, followed by Councillor Gold.
I think I'll leave it here.
Sorry, Councillor Bigger. Councillor Gold.
Thank you. A very simple addition to what Councillor Sinfield's just said. Once it's gone, is gone, and I'd like to extend that comment to the area and the street. Once this is accepted and built, it will set a precedence for these sorts of developments up and down the street, which will be lamentable. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gold. I have Councillor Park.
I think perhaps Councillor Galt misunderstands the basis of precedent because it does no such thing, firstly. Secondly, I think that it's important that councillors understand that a decision has been made on the refusal motion. It failed. So, absent, it seems to me the only practical way forward, I mean, we can spend the night here if we like, or we can accept that that's the position where we are, and before us is a motion with a number of conditions, and I'm not, you know, I'd rather this didn't happen, but one option is if there's something in particular about which you feel very strongly, you could seek to further condition the approval, or you could support this. But it seems to me that there's no point us debating ad infinitum. We need to accept the previous decision and come to a resolution on this.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Councillor Stavrou.
I understand Councillor Park's comment that in terms of some procedural matter, a draw in a motion results in a failure, but at the end of the day there are two motions here, and one motion is supporting a diametrically opposed position of the refusal to the motion up there, and we've all have read the material, and I think that it's not really that we're in debate as to whether procedurally the motion has failed. We basically, I think that this side believes that the proposal is not in sympathy with the House and the neighbourhood. I think that's the crux of it in my mind. And I don't believe what Councillor Watson said, that it complies, because I think we've heard many times that there is and even if we hadn't heard many times, there has to be a substantial subjective component to these decisions. And I'm not talking about here our personal aesthetics. You know, how big is the extension before it makes it big enough to actually not comply? I mean, eventually there has to be it's not going to be, you know, so many cubic metres. It's going to be some sort of subjective judgment. And I think that way that I feel, I'm not going to speak on fellow councillors on this side of the motion, I just think that this is far too large and too not sympathetic of a proposal with the House, and that's why I'm against it now. If it appears that we can't find through an impasse here, perhaps a deferral maybe in the offing, and perhaps when we get 11 councillors where we can't have a failure. We can't do a deferral, I'm heard by some, okay, well then we'll keep going around. Sorry, is this an appropriate time to make clarification? If we get 5 aside on this, it will just pass?
If this gets 5 aside, then I've got a casting vote. There is a procedural motion to lay this on the table for a fortnight, if that's available.
I think, Chair, you could just exercise your casting vote.
Or
it's unfettered.
Yeah.
Look, sorry, then there is the opportunity to defer it when there's 11 in the chamber. I think if that opportunity is available, I would say in terms of fairness to our community in Boroondara, because once it's gone, would rather do that.
So we've got did you have your light on, Councillor Franco? I'm not sure if you've spoken. Have you spoken?
I'll finish the debate. I'll speak at the end. But I wanted to make a point in relation to the comment that Councillor Stavrou made in relation to procedural fairness. We don't know how many councillors will be in this room in 2 weeks' time, whether there will be 11, whether 3 of us will be sick with COVID or not, or whatever. So we have the councillors that we have here today, and we should be making a decision, and I think that should stand.
Councillors, just give me 1 second, please. Councillors, before we move this motion, I'm going to seek a procedural motion to lay this on the table for a fortnight. Is anyone prepared to move that motion? And do I have a seconder? Is there any opposition on that? Okay. So councillors, we're in a procedural motion. So we need to work out whether this motion passes, and if not, we'll return back to the debate. So the mover of that motion was, just so I can, Councillor Stavrou, do you speak to motion, please?
Clearly, the reason for this motion is that we've gone around twice, and it seems to be that everybody has run out of their debates, and it's one way forward. The other one is, in the interim time, maybe some of the councillors that have opposed the Councillor Dye's motion might see the light in the next few weeks and change their mind.
Thank you. Do anyone else wish to speak to this? Councillor Franco?
Firstly, we haven't gone around twice. We've got the motion that I've moved and it hasn't been voted on, and the chair has a casting vote. So I think we should actually take the decision in relation to that. Secondly, deferring this to a future date is... On what basis can anyone assume how many of us will be sitting here in this chamber, and that those sitting here in 2 weeks' time are going to be exactly that? You know, we can assume and hope there'll be 11, but this is just abrogating our responsibility. We're here, we should be making a decision. Let's make a decision. If we can't make a decision at the end of the day, then I understand, but we've got a motion here before us to make a decision. We should make it.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Before I move to Councillor Park, if this motion fails, I'll be using my chair's casting vote. Councillor Park.
This will set an ugly precedent. We talk about precedents. I've been in this chamber for 10 years, and I was a councillor elsewhere for another 7 years. In that 17 years, no council on which I've sat has ever done what's being proposed here, because let's call a spade a spade. This is an attempt to defer the decision on Councillor Franco's motion until Councillor Hollingsworth is back in the chamber. That's what this is about. That would be a very, very ugly precedent. As Councillor Franco has rightly said, we don't know in 2 weeks' time who will or won't be here around this table. Although some seem to have an ability to see into the future, according to their contributions to the previous motions, none of us have that. It's entirely inappropriate, and the applicant, not to mention the submitters, have a reasonable expectation that this matter will be decided tonight. It's listed on the agenda, and there is no good reason to defer it. There's a clear way forward. The chair has an unfettered ability to exercise the casting vote as he sees fit. That might well be to defeat the motion. Only the chair knows how he would exercise it. But it ought to be exercised tonight. The matter ought to be determined tonight. There's no good reason not to.
Thank you, Councillor Park. I do have, just before I move back to the mover to round out debate, I've got Councillor Addis, followed by Councillor Sinfield.
Chair, with your indulgence, can I ask the officers where the clock is in terms of a decision and the ability for this to go to VCAT tomorrow?
Thanks for yourself, Chair. My understanding, based on feedback from the officers, is that we're on day 62, which would mean that we're now just over the 60-day statutory timeframe. So if a decision is not made this evening, an appeal can be lodged to VCAT on an out-of-time decision from any point forward.
Tomorrow. Could be.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Councillor Sinfield.
Thanks, Chair. I concur with the remarks made by Councillor Park and believe that the community has a right to have this matter decided this evening. While I suspect I might know how the absent councillor may cast their vote, I've not discussed the matter and therefore I don't know to whom the advantage would play out if we did have an additional 2 weeks to deliberate on this. I don't think that that's appropriate in the circumstance. I'm not afraid to make a decision on this and cast my vote, and I've been quite adamant as to which way I will vote. So as far as the procedural motion is concerned, I don't support postponing the decision for 2 weeks. Furthermore, I won't change my position on the substantive motion.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Appears to be no further lights, so Councillor Stavro, are you happy for us to put this procedural motion to the vote?
Only in saying a couple of things, just as the mover. Look, I certainly agree with the words that Councillor Sinfield said. I don't know which way Councillor Holdsworth is going to vote, and that's not the primary reason. I think we've seen earlier tonight Rosebery Street was something that was deferred, and something else came up. So I'm giving it the benefit that we could be able to perhaps visit the site and see the surrounds and perhaps get a different appreciation of what's in front of us. And some of us may be able to imagine it, others may not be able to imagine it from the papers. And I'm not saying that I know whether everybody's visited.
Thank you, Councillor Stavros. So the procedural motion that's on the table at the moment, councillors, I'm in search of those in favour. Those against? The procedural motion is defeated. So we will now return to the substantive motion, which was closed out by Councillor Franco. That is the officer's recommendation that's on the screen. All those in favour?
No, I haven't spoken to that.
Apologies. If you haven't spoken to it, Councillor Franco, please speak.
Thank you. No, I haven't closed out the debate. I just want to make the point, we've heard a lot about those opposing the proposed development, that it's about the protecting of the long-term conservation of the property in question. Well, I make the point clearly that it's the opposite. Supporting this is about the long-term heritage conservation, the significant fabric and the long-term value of the property in question. And I make that point unequivocally. And I also think there's an stated debate going on here about what it means to be in sympathy and the degree to which many people see in sympathy as being bordering on mimicry and faux heritage versus, something that's distinctive and uniquely contemporary that's easily distinguishable. I think that debate is at the heart of what's going on here. It may not be, but I think it is. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. I'll now put this motion to the vote. All those in favour? Those against? So I declare that councillors again is 5-5. As I am chair, I have a casting vote. In this instance, I will be declaring my vote in favour of the officer's recommendation, and I declare that motion carried. For the benefit of the gallery, the reason I am doing so is what we see on the screen is a reasonable outcome for this proposal. Absent of it going to VCAT, none of those conditions actually apply, and there's a risk in that. So I therefore cast my vote in favour of the officer's recommendation. The motion is carried. Councillor Park.
I'm presupposing, Chair, that you're going to move to general business, and I move a suspension of standing orders.
Thank you, Councillor Park. I do note that, and I've got Councillor Watson as a seconder to that.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
Can we have a show of hands for a suspension of standing orders? I declare that carried. Thank you, councillors. Councillor Park.
Chair, during the course of the previous item, Greg Deakin made comments about one of council's employees the comments were outrageous and utterly inappropriate, and I believe that a response is proposed by the CEO.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just make the point that Council's governance rules are designed to ensure that comments made in this chamber are respectful. We clearly expect that people will come to the chamber with a view, whether they be community members or councillors, in fact, and have some passion about what it is they wish to express. However, that does not justify behaviour which one needs to point out is not protected by privilege in this council chamber, and indeed the laws of the land, including defamation, apply. What's said in here has effectively been published, it's been transmitted, and it's on record. So I'd make the observation that the heritage consultant to whom those comments related has every right to take further action in response to them. But it's clearly completely inappropriate for any member of the community or indeed a councillor to be critical of their colleagues or of staff in the organisation. And the same goes for consultants we may engage to support us in dealing with matters before you. So I just want to really stress that that type of offensive comment is completely unacceptable and inappropriate in this forum.
Thank you, that is noted. Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Watson, I do apologise. And then Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. I'll let the slip go with no further comment. Chair, with your indulgence, I'd like to ask a question of the CEO in relation to the floods that are currently occurring in regional Victoria and in Maribyrnong.
You may. And
Thank
I think
you.
the CEO's about to respond.
Yes, so my question is Burundara able to assist those people that are in need? And the second thing I'd like, before I finish speaking and have our CEO answer that question, I do understand that we are in suspension of standing orders, but I'd like to have it noted that those people who are affected and their families are in our thoughts and prayers, and we hold grave concerns for their safety and well-being and wish them all the best. But I'll finish there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Burundara is a signatory to an MAV agreement, a protocol, which is basically set up to provide support for any local government areas suffering from some form of crisis, be that fire or flood, which happen to be our two most common, I guess. And we have in the past been associated with drought, of course, and drought relief. The situation at the present time is that some help has been sought by some of the councils impacted. Burundara has not yet been asked to provide any assistance, but if we are, then we will. In doing so, we need to be cognizant of the fact that this Sunday further heavy downpours are expected, and we will also need to make sure we do retain enough of our labour to be able to deal with issues which arise here as well. So we'll be endeavouring to make sure a balance applies, but at this point we've not been asked, but we are certainly ready and willing should we be.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Thank you. Councillor Sinfield, followed by Councillor Victor.
Thank you,
Councillor
Chair.
Franco.
I accept that standing orders have been suspended, but it is still a UPDC meeting. Nonetheless, I would just like to flag the security incident that occurred earlier in this meeting and request that steps be taken to remedy access. Case in point. Steps be taken to remedy access by bypassing security as a matter of priority. And I'll flag that this should be the topic of discussion at a CB&D councillor briefing either this evening or another evening in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Franco.
Having heard Councillor Watson's question about those in need in other municipalities, I'd like to ask a question, make a comment and ask a question about those in our own community here in Boroondara. I've been approached by many residents, including my own ward, and some of the neighbouring wards are in flood zones, and they fear for the potential flooding of their own homes. They have raised questions with me about what our council can do, and I know council staff have been investigating some aspects, particularly around the Gardeners Creek, which is prone to flooding in the Gardeners Creek area. And I'd just like to hear from either the CEO or the director, just if we could have an assurance that we will prioritise those residents and look at the needs of those residents to the extent that we can, particularly in relation to stormwater. Thanks.
Perhaps I might just mention a couple of things which, first of all, we do in advance of weather events like those forecasts, and that is to minimise the extent to which flooding will occur. So that includes a range of programs related to the drainage network, particularly pit clearance and so on, to ensure that there are no obstructions there as far as we can possibly manage that. So first of all, we take proactive steps in advance of the event to minimise the likelihood of flooding. The actual response during flooding itself is really more for the SES and the police, depending upon what the issue is, not so much for council. When we get more into the recovery phase, if you like, that is where council will play a role in helping people get back on their feet in a variety of different ways. But it's a very carefully designed process to ensure we're not getting in each other's way, and so our staff would become more involved post the event itself. But as far as possible, it's very much about doing what you can in advance to mitigate the likelihood. The other observation I would make is that there's a broader question here, which is the adequacy of drainage more generally across the state, and certainly we're talking about Boroondara and Melbourne, what happens in the city. And ultimately all our drains flow into Melbourne Water drains and or rivers controlled by Melbourne Water. And if we don't have adequate capacity to deal with the runoff, whether that be in the form of the drains themselves or in the form of retarding basins and detention systems, then these types of events are always going to have the sorts of impacts we are seeing. And perhaps, without entering into this debate, the whole conversation around what happened at Flemington Racecourse is very interesting, because there potentially was a perfect retarding basin which could have actually taken pressure off the surrounding residential areas, and it hasn't. So these are the ways in which we need to be thinking about, the future in Melbourne when we're going to have those types of events taking place.
Thank you, Mr. Storer. I do have one further. Councillor Park.
I was just going to move a resumption of standing orders, Chair.
Sounds good to me. There's no other lights on, so can I have a seconder for that? Councillor Bigger. Put that motion to the vote. I'll declare that carried. So we'll just return to general business. Are there any other items of general business? There being none. Items of urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business? There being none. Confidential business. There are no items of confidential business. So I declare our planning meeting closed at 9:30 Thank you to our gallery and also our councillors and staff. The meeting is now closed.